It was a crisp Saturday morning when I noticed the line of cars creeping up the gravel drive that led to my secluded lakefront cabin. Vehicles too polished and expensive to belong to my neighbors, more like the kind of shiny sedans and SUVs you'd expect to see idling outside an open house in some manicured suburban cul-de-sac, not bouncing over potholes on a private road that hadn't seen asphalt in decades. And as I leaned on the porch rat, already sensed trouble brewing. Because these weren't lost tourists or friendly visitors, they were following behind a black Mercedes with a magnetic sign on the side that read Henderson Realty Group, and the woman behind the wheel wore the kind of perfectly pressed blazer and calculated smile that screamed commission check. And when they rolled past the big wooden gate I'd installed at the base of my driveway, my suspicion turned into fury. B. And white sign I had absolutely not put there. Open house today, 11 a.m. to 2 p.m., lakefront cabin, pristine views, move-in ready, with my exact address printed in bold letters underneath, as if my home, the property I'd bought outright years ago, with no mortgage and no ties to anyone, had suddenly been put up for grabs like it was some cheap foreclosure listing. And the moment I saw it, I knew exactly who was behind it. In the moment I saw it, I knew exactly who was behind it. Roped me into her little fiefdom, insisting that even though my cabin predated the neighborhood by 30 years and sat on land never deeded into their covenants, I still benefited from their so-called amenities and therefore owed my share, which was her way of saying she wanted a cut of my freedom. And every time I laughed her off, she doubled down, first sending letters, then fines, then threats. Until finally she must have decided to escalate. Finally, she must have decided to escalate. Home was hers to sell, rope in some greedy realtor, and hope the intimidation would either scare me into compliance or force me to move. But she didn't count on one thing. I don't scare easy, and I certainly don't move just because some self-appointed dictator decides she wants me gone. So as the realtor started her fake tour, waving clients up the drive with brochures in hand, I walked calmly to the gate, swung it shut with a heavy clad, calmly to the gate, swung it shut with a heavy clad. My side of the property lined like fish in a barrel, their expensive shoes crunching awkwardly on gravel as they realized the open house wasn't quite what they expected. And then, just to drive the point home, I pulled a second sign out of the shed, one I had painted for just such an occasion, with bold black letters that read, "Private property, trespassers will be prosecuted, not for sale," and planted it right next to her fry. Striding down the hill with a storm brewing in my eyes, she plastered on that fake professional smile and chirped, "Oh, hello. You must be the caretaker. Could you unlock the house for us? The seller didn't mention you'd be here." And I laughed so hard it must have chilled her bones because I set down my coffee, stared her dead in the eye, and said, "Lady, I'm the owner. And the only thing for sale today is your dignity when I call the sheriff and explain that you're running an open house on property that isn't yours." And just like that, the clients froze, their hopeful chatter dying mid-sentence, eyes darting from me to her as the whoa because a wifeful chatter dying mid-sentence, eyes darting from me to her as the They weren't attending a showing, they were trespassing in the middle of a con job, one orchestrated by a desperate HOA president who thought she could bluff me into submission. And as I reached for my phone, already dialing the sheriff's direct line, I could feel a slow smile spread across my face. Not because I enjoyed conflict, but because I knew in that moment Karen had overplayed her hand so spectacularly that she'd left herself no escape route. Be about embarrassing her. It would be about dismantling her power for good. The realtor's face drained of color the moment I mentioned calling the sheriff, her manicured fingers tightening around the clipboard she carried as if the papers attached could somehow shield her from the storm that was about to roll in, and the prospective buyers, a mix of couples in khakis and summer dresses with that overeager sparkle of people hoping to snatch up a hidden gem for cheap, suddenly shifted uneasily on their feet, glancing between me. Confident facade was slipping by the second, and as the silence grew thicker, I decided to let it drag, to let every last one of them stew in the awkward realization that they'd been duped into trespassing on private property. And only when I saw one of the buyers whisper to her husband, pointing back toward their SUV as though calculating how fast they could leave, did I finally raise my phone and press the call button. Because if there's one thing, and press the call button. Because if there's one thing, and then It's that people like Karen only understand authority when it comes from someone in uniform with flashing lights behind them. And sure enough, when the dispatcher answered and I calmly explained that there was a realtor hosting an open house on property that wasn't hers, complete with strangers milling around as though my front porch were a showroom, the promise of sending a deputy out immediately sent a ripple through the group. Some of them all read, immediately sent a ripple through the group. Some of them all read, all rest from no rest, all refing. Wasn't about to let them all slink off without the lesson sticking. So I told them clearly, nobody leaves until law enforcement arrives, because whether you realize it or not, you're standing in the middle of criminal trespass. And while I don't blame you for being misled, I can't have a dozen witnesses disappearing before statements are taken. And the firmness in my tone stopped them cold. Their guilt written plain as day on their faces as they read some cranky homeowner yelling from his porch, but the legal owner of the land who was about to make a very big problem for anyone tied to this charade, and the realtor, scrambling now, tried her first defense. Oh, there must be some confusion. Mrs. Peterson from the HOA assured me she had full authority to list this property. I was just doing my job. And the way she said Mrs. Peterson, with that false reverence, told me every something, feeding her lies about ownership and hoping to strong-arm me through sheer spectacle, but where she'd underestimated me was assuming I'd panic or fold under public embarrassment, when in truth, the more public it got, the stronger my position became. And so I leaned against the locked gate, folded my arms, and said loud enough for everyone to hear. So you admit you were working on instructions from an HOA president who has no legal claim, claim. Attempted fraudulent sale of private property? Because that's what it sounds like to me. And I'll make sure the deputy hears it too. And the realtor's lips parted like she wanted to backpedal, but no words came out, only a nervous glance toward the buyers who were now whispering furiously, realizing they'd been dragged into a scam that could tarnish them as much as her. And after about 15 agonizing minutes of tense waiting, the sound of gravel crunching announced salvation in the form of a salvation in the form of a papilia. 15 agonizing minutes of salvation in the form of a pine pedal. An hour of veil crunching announced salvation in the form of a pyre. Presence undeniable, and when Deputy Collins stepped out, an old friend of mine who had fished off my dock more than once, his eyes went immediately from me to the realtor to the sign she'd hung, and without hesitation, he said, "What the hell's going on here, John? Looks like a circus." I explained everything in measured detail, laying out how I discovered the fraudulent sign, the realtor's open house scam, and the HOA's long-standing harassment campaign. And when I was done, Collins whistled low and turned to the realtor, his notebook already in hand, asking in that slow, deliberate voice that meant trouble, "Ma'am, can you explain why you're conducting business on a property that doesn't belong to you? Advertising it as for C." Her pre-scripted excuse about being misled by the HOA, but the deputy wasn't having it, interrupting her halfway to say, "Ignorance doesn't fly here. You're responsible for verifying ownership before putting up signs, before scheduling showings, before bringing people onto someone else's land. That's called due diligence, and you skipped it." And as her shoulders sagged, I could almost feel the tension in the group break, because now it wasn't just me calling them out. The law was speaking, and Karen's little scheme was unraveling in real time. But the cherry on top came when Collins asked the realtor point blank for the paperwork authorizing her to sell the supposed listing agreement, and when she reluctantly handed it over, the owner, but by HOA President Karen Peterson, who had scrawled her name on the seller's line as though that magically granted her rights she never had. And when Collins saw it, his eyes narrowed in disbelief, muttering, "This is one of the dumbest things I've seen in my career," before tucking it carefully into an evidence bag. And then, to my delight, he pulled out his radio and called in backup, saying words I'll never forget. We've pulled out his radio and called in backup, saying words I'll never forget. We've rolled out his radio and called in backup, saying words I'll never forget. We were tucking it carefully into an evidence bag. We've poured out his radio and called in backup. Trespass orchestrated by an HOA president. Going to need a statement from the DA's office on next steps. and the ripple of panic that ran through the group was almost comical. The buyers murmuring that they had no idea, some even apologizing directly to me for stepping foot on my land, but I waved them off, telling them the only apology I wanted was their signatures on witness statements confirming that the realtor invited them, distance themselves from liability, which left the realtor standing alone, sweating under the deputy's stare, as Collins told her she was free to call Karen, but it wouldn't do much good because she was now complicit, and as if the universe was scripting the perfect drama. Not 10 minutes later, a gaudy white Lexus pulled up with Karen herself behind the wheel, stepping out in her oversized sunglasses and clutching a binder like it was hay. Sneer, only to freeze when she saw Collins waiting, hand on his hip, expression unreadable, and I'll never forget the way her voice cracked slightly as she demanded, "Officer, what is the meaning of this? These are my clients, and this man is obstructing an official showing." A line so absurd Collins actually laughed, shook his head, and replied, "Karen, you're about 2 minutes away from handcuffs if you keep talking like that." And the look on her face, the mixture of shock, fury, and dawning realization that her plan had not only failed but backfired spectacularly, was sweeter than any revenge I could have scripted. Because in that moment, everyone saw her for what she really was, a fraud, a bully, and everyone saw her for what she really was. A fraud, a bully, and everyone saw her for what she really was. Karen stood frozen for a moment after Colin's warning, her lips tightening into a thin line as though she couldn't quite decide whether to double down or finally retreat. And of course, anyone who knew Karen knew retreat wasn't in her vocabulary. So after a long pause, she flung her sunglasses off dramatically, jabbed a manicured finger at me across the gate, and shouted, "This man doesn't belong here." The HOA voted unanimously to reclaim this land as community property, and I have every right to enforce that decision, which might have been convincing to the poor buyers earlier, but sounded like pure madness when said in front of a uniformed deputy with a badge gleaming under the afternoon sun. And Collins, bless him, didn't even bother with politeness anymore. He just let out this dry chuckle, pulled his citation pad from his belt, pulled his citation pad from his belt, land it doesn't own. You know that. You've been warned before about harassing John, and now you dragged a licensed professional into criminal activity by convincing her to sign fraudulent contracts. That's not a civil dispute anymore. That's fraud, attempted theft, and conspiracy. And the gasp from the little cluster of buyers who were still standing awkwardly nearby because Collins told them they had to remain for statements was like fuel to the fire, their eyes widening as if they were watching the mask slip off the queen bee of their neighborhood, the all-powerful HOA president reduced to a sputtering mess of excuses, and of course Kat, her voice so much that it felt like intimidation, yelling, "You don't understand, officer. We have bylaws, covenants, signatures. You can't just ignore the rules. This cabin is practically community property." And I couldn't help myself. I laughed out loud, the sound cutting across her rant because it was just so deliciously absurd. The idea that by scribbling her name on a piece of paper and bullying her neighbors, she somehow believed she could override land deeds and state law. And when I pulled my own folder from under my arm, flipping it open to reveal the original deed, deep peep and deep precision, deed revealed the original deeds and state law. And when I pulled my own folder from under my arm, flipping it open to reveal the original deeds, printed clearly across the top, I held it up for everyone to see and said, "Here's the only signature that matters, mine. Deed, dated 1985, registered with the county clerk, taxes paid up to the last cent, Karen. The only thing you've got is a binder full of hot air and a string of harassment charges waiting to drop." And Collins, seeing the opportunity, leaned in and said, "He's right. And let me remind you that fraudulent transfer of property isn't just a fine, it's a felony in this county. You want me to call the DA and see how he feels about your little paperwork stunt?" And for once, Karen had no quick comeback, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping on a dock, until finally she snapped at the realtor. "You were supposed to handle this. Why didn't you verify? Why didn't you secure the paperwork?" And the realtor, desperate to save her own skin, practically shouted back, "Because you told me you were the owner. You said the community had seized it. You said he was just squatting here. You lied to me." And it was like watching rats scramble when the ship starts to sink. Both women turning on each other in front of witnesses, their alliance dissolving into finger-pointing and accusations, and Collins just shook his head, muttering, "This is better than cable," before raising his voice and saying, "Enough. Karen, you and the realtor are both coming with me for questioning. Buyers, you'll give written statements before leaving. John, I'll need you down at the station later to file an official complaint." And while that might have sounded like a hassle to anyone else, to me it was sweet music, because the more official paperwork got filed, the more leverage I'd have to crush Karen's little empire once and for all. So I nodded eagerly, telling him I'd be there as soon as I secured my property, and Collins motioned for his backup to escort the women to their cars. The pretty, spitting venom in every direction, screaming about how this wasn't over, how I'd regret humiliating her, how the full force of the HOA would come down on me, and that last line made Collins bark a laugh, because even he couldn't resist mocking her, saying, "Karen, the HOA isn't the Supreme Court. It's a bunch of neighbors bickering about mailbox paint. Quit acting like you're the governor," which sent a ripple of suppressed laughter through the buyers, some of whom actually chuckled openly now that the power dynamic had flipped, and I soaked it all in, every second of her unraveling, because this was the kind of humiliation she dished out so often to others, and seeing her taste it herself was priceless. But of course, Karen wasn't the type to lick her wounds quietly, and sure enough, the very next morning, after I'd locked my gate tighter than Fort Knox and added a brand new private property trespassers will be prosecuted sign for good measure, I woke to the sound of hammering at dawn. And when I looked out, there were half a dozen HOA volunteers nailing their own sign to the utility pole just beyond my driveway. This huge banner that complete with a printed seal of their board like they thought it was some official government body. And I actually laughed so hard coffee nearly came out my nose because, if anything, it proved just how desperate Karen was, willing to escalate into outright slander when the law wasn't on her side. And I didn't waste any time snapping photos, emailing them to Collins, and forwarding them straight to my attorney, who replied in less than 5 minutes with a now, defamation, harassment, possible RICO if we link their board votes. And that was the first time it really hit me that this wasn't just petty neighborhood drama anymore. It was the beginning of a full-blown legal war, one that I was more than ready to fight, because unlike Karen and her cronies, I had both the patience and the resources to drag this battle out as long as it took. And if it meant dismantling her entire HOA structure or HOA structure, entire HOA structure or HOA structure, HOA structure, unpaid legal bills, then so be it. Because after what she pulled with that realtor scam, I wasn't just going to defend my cabin. I was going to make sure she never had the chance to victimize another neighbor again. The morning after Karen's ridiculous illegal squatter banner stunt, I thought maybe she would finally simmer down after the embarrassment Collins had put her through, but of course, Karen wasn't the type to retreat when cornered. She was the type to double down, and that's exactly what she did, unleashing a full-blown HOA retaliation campaign that could have been mistaken for a political war chest operation if it weren't so laughably misdirected. Official-looking violation notices claiming everything from improper landscaping to unauthorized structural modifications, which was rich considering I didn't even live within their HOA boundaries, and each one had fines attached in the thousands, all written on letterhead designed to look like legal documents, clearly meant to scare me into submission. But instead of being intimidated, I carefully cataloged every single one, snapping photos, then straight to my lawyer with the subject line, "More evidence of harassment," and his reply was a simple, "Keep them coming, this is gold," which made me smile because the trap was setting itself with every desperate move Karen made. But harassment by paper wasn't enough for her. So soon after, she escalated the physical tactics, and one evening I noticed strange tire tracks leading onto the gravel near my gate, as if someone here from as if someone here from my is a someone here gate, as if someone here for biak, as if someone here watched for biak tracks leading onto the gravel near my gate. As if someone hit steel posts. I'd sunk 6 feet into concrete held fast, leaving only scuff marks and a broken taillight lens. And when I checked the trail cams I'd installed earlier, lo and behold, there was grainy footage of 2 HOA board members in the middle of the night, clearly trying to ram the gate open with a pickup before giving up and speeding off, which was so blatant it almost felt like parody. And when I turned that footage over to Collins, the Ned, footage over to Collins, the Ned, don't know when to quit, do they? before promising to tack on charges for vandalism and attempted trespass, which only fueled my determination to push this fight as far as it could go. And sure enough, things really blew up the following week when I received a certified letter, not from the HOA but from the county court itself, informing me that the HOA had filed an injunction against me, claiming my cabin was abandoned and subbing fabrication that I actually laughed out loud in the clerk's office when I went down to verify. But my lawyer, sharp as ever, leaned in with this grin and said, "This is perfect. We've been waiting for them to step into a courtroom because now we can bury them with discovery." And that was when the game shifted from backwoods harassment to full-blown legal war. Because once we were inside that courthouse, Karen and her cronies couldn't hide behavior to produce evidence, sworn testimony, and actual law to back their claims. And of course, they had nothing but smoke and mirrors. Still, I knew Karen well enough to expect theatrics, and boy did she deliver. Because on the day of the first hearing, she strutted into the courtroom in a blazer 2 sizes too flashy, carrying binders stacked so high she could barely balance them, flanked by 2 board members who looked like they'd been dragged in as her eye. Stern old man with zero patience for nonsense asked her to state her claim. Karen launched into this grandstanding monologue about protecting community integrity and preserving property values and removing unsightly squatters, as though she were arguing in front of Congress instead of a county judge. And when she finally pointed at me across the aisle and said, "This man has no legal right to that cabin," I calmly slid my deed across to the judge, who adjusted his glasses, read the document for all of 10 seconds, and then looked back at Karen with this expression that said, "Are you serious?" before asking, "Ms. Thompson, do you have any legally binding document that supersedes a registered property deed?" And of course, she didn't, but that didn't stop her from fumbling through her binders, producing HOA bylaws and neighborhood bylaws and neighborhood bylaws and neighborhood binders and my neighborhood HOA bylaws and neighborhood property. Judge interrupted her to clarify, "Ma'am, these documents only apply to properties within your HOA subdivision, and Mr. John's property is not within that subdivision, correct?" She actually had the gall to say, "Well, it should be," which made the entire courtroom break into muffled laughter, and the judge slammed his gavel to restore order, but even he couldn't suppress the smirk tugging at his lips. And from that moment on, I showed you that. Despise, it's people wasting their time with frivolous, ego-driven lawsuits. Still, the real victory wasn't just having the injunction dismissed on the spot. It was when my lawyer filed a countersuit immediately after, citing harassment, defamation, attempted fraud, and malicious prosecution, stacking up charges like firewood, and the judge, still annoyed by Karen's antics, fast-tracked our motion, granting us discovery rights to comb through Rue. Because once we had access to their books, everything unraveled. The receipts showed Karen had authorized payments to the realtor, HOA funds spent on fraudulent signage, and even reimbursements for security patrols that were really just board members sneaking onto my land. And with every piece of evidence, the case against them grew heavier, to the point where even some of the HOA members began jumping ship, refusing to back Karen in wrath. But Karen, blinded by her own ego, kept pushing, showing up at the next hearing with even wilder claims, like saying my cabin was a safety hazard or that it violated community aesthetic standards, which was laughable since it was a rustic cabin in the woods surrounded by nature, not part of their cookie-cutter subdivision. And when the judge asked her again if she had any legal precedent whatsoever, she snapped, "The HOA is the 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 HOA. The HOA is the HOA." Disbelief, and that line ended up in the local paper the next day after a reporter covering the case quoted it verbatim, turning Karen into a laughingstock county-wide with headlines like "HOA president declares herself above the law." And by then, the snowball was rolling downhill fast, because the more Karen flailed, the more the public and the law turned against her. And I could almost sit back and let her self-destruct, but I wasn't. Could never dared to pull something like this again. Not with me, not with anyone. So I worked closely with my lawyer to build the most ironclad countersuit possible, aiming not just for damages but for a full injunction stripping the HOA of any authority over properties outside their legal subdivision, which meant they couldn't harass neighbors, couldn't post fake signs, couldn't file nuisance suits against anyone they disliked, essentially declawing them then didn't of the nuisance suits against anyone they disliked, essentially declawing them. You could see the panic ripple through the HOA ranks, board members quitting left and right, homeowners whispering about special elections, everyone realizing that Karen's crusade wasn't just her personal vendetta anymore. It was threatening to destroy the entire HOA structure from within, and that was exactly what I wanted. Because Karen had built her little empire on fear, intimidation, and fake authority. And now, by pushing me too far, and far had pushing me too far, seeing me too far cement completely piece by piece until all that remained was a cautionary tale about a woman who thought she could sell what she didn't own and wound up losing everything instead. The day of the final hearing felt like the culmination of months of warfare. Every petty notice, every midnight intrusion, every fake for sale sign, boiling down to one decisive moment where the truth would be carved into the record books. And as I walked into the courthouse, I noticed Karen already seated at the plaintiff's table, her face pinched tight like a lemon left out in the sun, piles of binders stacked around her like sandbags, as though she submission. But the funny thing about paper fortresses is they crumble as soon as real evidence hits them. And that was exactly what my lawyer was about to deliver, because over weeks of discovery we had gathered not only proof of their fraud and harassment, but also financial mismanagement, misuse of HOA funds, and blatant falsification of documents, all tied back to Karen's reckless leadership. And when the judge called the case to 2-2, pressing down on the room, Karen launched into her final performance, voice shrill, theatrics turned up to 11, declaring that if the court didn't strip me of my squatter's cabin, the entire community's property values would collapse, and that I had single-handedly terrorized the neighborhood with my refusal to comply, her finger jabbing at me like I was a criminal defendant instead of the landowner. But before the judge could expression and said, "Your Honor, may we begin by submitting Exhibit A?" And that was the moment the entire room tilted in my favor, because Exhibit A was a certified deed dating back decades, traced, notarized, and ironclad, proving in black and white that my land was privately owned and never once subjected to HOA covenants. And when the judge glanced at it, nodded, and muttered, "Clear as day," you could see the panic flash in Karen's eyes. But we didn't stop there. We moved to Exhibit B, the CA of night, which drew an audible gasp from the gallery, then Exhibit C, financial records showing HOA dues spent to hire that realtor to market my cabin without permission, then Exhibit D, screenshots of emails where Karen instructed board members to treat him like a trespasser, despite knowing the truth, and by the time we reached Exhibit E, a signed affidavit from that same realtor admitting Karen had misrepresented the property. Stunned silence, broken only by the judge's pen scratching furiously across his notes. And finally, my lawyer leaned back, folded his hands, and said, "Your Honor, this is not a dispute over property. This is a sustained campaign of harassment, fraud, and malicious abuse of power." And then he motioned toward me and added, "And my client has endured it with patience, but enough is enough." Karen tried to object, her voice rising in pitch, sputtering about community preservation and collective agreements. But the judge shut her down with one sharp gavel crack and said, "Miss Thompson, the only thing I see preserved here is your pattern of overreach." And with that, he dismissed their injunction outright, ruled in my favor on every count of the countersuit, and ordered the HOA to pay damages for harassment, defamation. Members behind Karen visibly sagged in their seats, realizing their HOA funds, money scraped from their own neighbors' dues, were about to vanish into restitution payments. And then came the final blow. The judge granted my injunction permanently prohibiting the HOA from asserting any authority outside its legal boundaries, a ruling that stripped them of their intimidation power and set a legal precedent other communities could cite if their HOA perceived just lost her little war with me. She had triggered a legal chain reaction that neutered her empire for good. But my revenge didn't end there, because after the hearing, the local press swarmed us outside the courthouse, reporters eager for sound bites, and while Karen tried to hide behind her oversized sunglasses,